since the beginning, we focus on small-scale technologies and on the needs of the people. We follow SD criteria already since the beginning, and we focus also on the local practitioners and that they themselves implement, and we think they are the change makers for the transition. So we facilitate implementation and the replication through sustainable energy projects. So it's called ZEPS program. So far we have supported around 100 projects. So, but when we started in the first 4 or 5 years, we said, okay, it's nice, we have good projects. But then we found out there are so many good local organizations with so much knowledge. On the other hand, they all face the same challenges, and they don't talk to each other, and they have no opportunity to exchange their experiences. And this is when we started to support all and think about networks and exchange activities. By the way, the focus of our technology is now on biogas, hydropower, and small wind, and mainly on productive uses and community needs. Coming back to this aspect of inspired change through practitioners, we really think that practitioner networks is a way forward to ensure this exchange and make sure that these gaps are filled. We have heard so many things in the first panel that are aspects that people can learn from each other. We started in Latin America already 10 years ago. There's Red Biolac, which is the network for Latin America's biogas practitioners, and it has been tremendous. In the beginning, they just exchanged on technology aspects, but then there was more and more like delivery models, how to go for a productive end use. Now they do trainings, now they do every year a conference with 100 participants, and they are really proud of their network, and they have a voice through the network. Then there was a national, there is a national network run by Biolac, a web network on small-scale wind, and of course HPNet that I will focus on now. Through HPNet, we also understood that really the direct exchange between the practitioners and the networks also needs a bit of fun and needs activities. So we supported several trainings and exchange workshops, practice to policy trainings, etc. So exchange activity is a very broad expression, but we understand a lot of things under it that are needed by the practitioners. In the coffee break, we would have heard about a mini grid game, but this is also coming up later. I think this is also a good example, or a working group on electric load controller. So as overview, we have the ZEPS projects, we support the practitioner networks and exchange activities, but also we do, as we are researchers, research on the experiences we gain. For example, we do post-evaluations and try through this to understand how can productive use really be triggered. What is going on not only 1, but 2, 4, 6 years after the finalization of this small-scale energy projects? Why are they still running or why not? And we try to spread this in webinars, in scientific papers, etc. This is the overview of the networks and the projects. And I'd like to highlight a bit Hydro Empowerment Network, because I think this is really a tremendous success story. This is the youngest network, but it increased so tremendously in the last few years. So we cooperate with the network since 2013. We were with them when it was initiated. And we, as I said, have several knowledge exchanges. One was mentioned in the panel already, knowledge exchange for MHP committees to give training and see how can the enterprise being built out of this, how can it be more effective, and this was quite successful, this project. There's also no, sorry, I wanted to go back. There's also a nice little film on that. Another good example is on finance solution. So there was a workshop just in Yangon in March, done by Nexus for Development. So these gaps of how to talk the right finance language, the practitioners also often do not know how to do a pitch, etc. This was trained, and there was a peer-to-peer learning and also a dialogue of entrepreneurs. So I think this was also quite helpful. Let's see what is coming out of it. But there's also discussions within the networks about this. And I'd like to end my presentation with some very fresh impressions, because you might have seen that most of the panelists were a bit tired because we had an intensive weekend, a gathering of all the members. There was some pictures just done yesterday, yeah, I think there is so much power in these networks and exchanges, and this is something that is often not supported. And if I just would like to emphasize that. More value is given to that. And what we also now do is webinars, and I also like to invite you to a next webinar on the 28th. I think it's on financing, so the role of local banks, and this is also in cooperation with Energypedia, which is also highly appreciated. So thank you for your attention.
Welcome everybody to this second session looking at hydropower as enterprise. We've been using the terms interchangeably, how to encourage enterprises powered by hydro. I want to shift the focus a little bit more in this session to how to turn microhydro themselves into an enterprise. So the viability of the enterprise being expansion of microhydro themselves, of which a subset is that they should finance productive enterprises as a way to be viable. So the other distinction, Divyam already did a pretty exhaustive first round, so I don't want to repeat the questions. The focus here we're trying to do is what government actions specifically can support turning hydro into enterprise, and what government actions in some cases can take away from that. So we talked a lot about Nepal in the last session. I also started my career doing microhydro in Nepal. We have a long history going back to the 1980s. And one thing that, while people saw Bir Bahadur's experience starting microhydro from 1991, when he was just 20 or 21 at that time, making 50 trips to Kathmandu, as was discussed. At that time, when the Agricultural Development Bank was both providing the subsidy and the credit, the history of microhydro, I don't know how many people here know, but really microhydro in Nepal started with enterprises. There was no subsidy in the early days, because it really started with milling, So in the hills of Nepal, the diesel was being carried on people's backs to start running rice mills. There was a grinder at the bottom of by the river, which was good for grinding corn and wheat, but there wasn't a technology for hulling rice or pressing oil. And when the first cross-flow turbines were introduced in Nepal in the 1970s, these immediately became cost covering. So by the early 1980s, when microhydro, as in electricity generating hydro, started, there were already 1,000 turbines throughout the hills of Nepal, which didn't need any subsidy. They were enterprise-based. And then in 1984, when government finally delicensed electricity generation, a lot of the entrepreneurs started adding generators, which electricity became one of the productive uses of that turbine. So it was milling all day, and then at night, the belt would be moved over. So the first microhydro were really all entrepreneur run, because milling was all run by entrepreneurs. And as it became clear that electricity actually needed a subsidy, because the reference was, what was the tariff people were paying in the cities? And when you tried to match that, government said, well, we better provide a subsidy, otherwise the tariffs in rural areas will be much higher than in the city, and politically that would not be accepted. So the first people who developed the microhydros in Nepal were entrepreneurs, because they initially started out as millers. They were doing the milling. Bir Bahadur's was one of the first projects which was pretty much fully electricity, and then was where the electricity was used later. But one of the key things in Nepal, I think a misstep perhaps in retrospect, was that during the scale-up process, entrepreneurs like Bir Bahadur were taken out from the national program. Because as the subsidy program grew bigger, different donors put in the resources, the government program basically argued that if there's going to be 50% subsidy provided, it should not go to an entrepreneur, it should go to the community. And hence, starting in the early 2000s, increasingly, especially with the Maoist rebellion in rural Nepal, which was also discouraging of entrepreneurs in rural areas, those two came together, and basically, ever since the rebellion, the Maoist rebellion started in 1996, so really all the way from that time, I mean, he built his in 1991, but after, the late 1990s, a lot of the hydro really was community-owned. So, and these community-owned systems, when we went and evaluated them later, really were not that well organized in terms of, being enterprise-based. So with that background, just wanting to set the tone in terms of how government policies can support enterprise, or maybe not support enterprises. Let me start. I think our first presentation is going to be with Mr. Who's making the first presentation? With Butch Silvano, experience from NEA, in terms of turning the microhydros in Philippines towards enterprise. Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bikash. Thank you for still being here. Okay, this one is a project we did together with ADB, and I'd like to continue what the first panel had earlier finished by asking themselves whether an isolated microgrid would be sustainable if grid connected, and I'll show you proof that it is. So this is where we show it, and of course I hope ADB supports me because we did this together. Okay, this is under the ADB technical assistance. It's a rural community-based renewable energy development in Mindanao. That's south of the Philippines for those not Filipinos. So I'm the head of the total electrification and renewable energy development department of the National Electrification Administration. I'm with the government, but the permitting portion is not with us. We are also an implementer in that sense. Can I have? Oh, it's here. Okay, just a backgrounder. We did this with ADB under TA 87781 way back 4 years ago. This was never presented before. It's the first time that we're presenting this because there is already a story to tell. Before, we had to see first what would happen. So for now, we have a story to tell. And ours is NEA as executing agency in partnership with Dasoreco is the electric utility in the area where the project is. So aside from NEA, we were collaborating with other national and regional agencies involved in the project. That's the Department of Energy, the NCIP, ERC for the tariff, NCIPs for the IPs, DNR for the environment, and the Mindanao Development Authority because they have that there in Mindanao. So the purpose really was just to support the Philippine government to increase access to energy in rural areas in Mindanao. So as an objective, of course, develop and provide a business model where livelihood development is also from that renewable energy. And then outputs would be, of course, an RE resource and demand assessment, that's one. Then pilot a renewable energy project, that's the microhydro. And then the productive use of renewable energy, in this case, was a corn sheller. And then establishment of a CBO and a revolving fund for livelihood enhancement. So that's very clear. And then knowledge transfer. So scope, of course, we at NEA, we were supposed to collaborate with all the agencies involved. And we help in the technical training and support. And then supported by the consultants to identify the strong community-based organization or local organization in the area, because this one was something critical. You'll find out later. Then ADB was, of course, together with his consulting firm, Lameyer, was supposed to install the pilot project and then establish the revolving fund. The revolving fund came from ADB. And then livelihood development for the CBO and development of training materials. Then in the end, the pilot facilities, all of it built under the TA, were turned over to the CBO, including the revolving fund. If you're going to ask me, I'd like to tell you in advance that in your case, if you are the investor or the developer, then you would be taking the shoes of ADB here. So is a partnership, a joint venture, or a tripartite could do between the community-based organization, the utility, and you as an investor or developer or technology provider. In this case, because this was a test case, was ADB. So this is how we did it. The community was organized and capacitated to manage its poverty alleviation development. We created the RECDA. The RECDA is the local CBO and registered it legally. Then the community supported by the LGU applied for the necessary permits, so it's in the name of the CBO, to develop and operate the MHPP, assisted by ADB and us. Then the EC constructed electric grid, so you know their counterpart. Oh, thank you. Then MHPP and corn sheller were constructed and sales a success, and the revenue of the MHPP and corn sheller goes to the community revolving fund. Okay, that's how it looks. The MHP plus and then the consumers. So this is the actual one, which I just I had shots just last month, June 7, when I went there, because Dipti asked me if I can present this one, so I had to rush there for 1 week. So that's how it looks. It's in Davao Sur, the Marcelino Canalum, and it's 25 kilowatt, and there's a distribution line, which is a counterpart of the utility. So that's it, and there's a round-up cost for the hydro and the lines. It's a rounded up figure. So that's how it looks. So just as a project brief, it served the Bland tribe. That's the IPP, in upland communities. It's 12 kilometers from the main road, 1.5 motorcycle ride, or 4x4. We were crossing, you'll cross 7 rivers before you reach the site. And then originally there were 140 households. Then after a year or so, it turned 194, of course. And then about 1,000 population. 4 situs or communities now covered. Then industry is corn, abaca, and coconut. So they have a lot of expansion. They can do more. For now, it's corn that they're doing as a livelihood, as productive use of energy with the microhydro. So cooperation partnership with, I've said that before. Date of completion was last April 2015. That was 4 years ago. Commissioning after 2-3 months, and then synchronization the following year. So it operated isolated for 1 year and then synchronized with the grid the following year under net metering. You could not have done this if you didn't have the partnership with the electric cooperative. That's how we do it now. We have this model that we are trying to support, that all microgrids or mini grids in that sense would always be grid ready, because in any case the grid comes in, your project don't go to waste. It doesn't matter. It even becomes more sustainable if the grid comes. I'll show you some figures. So it's now operating 24/7, 5 kilowatt to 25 kilowatt maximum. 3 operators, mostly women, because these are the housewives and the men are farmers. Almost all are farmers here. So the corn sheller is the productive use. So seed money was around $12,000. That was given by ADB. And then less the corn sheller, that's about 450,000 pesos. And then there are 4 levels of entrepreneurship, of enterprising. First was the corn sheller was earning by that much. After 30 months of evaluation. When I went there, that was a little bit 36 months, but the data was only good for 30 months. So after 30 months, this is what I got. First level, they earned by that much. Second level, and the third level was about 1.2 million or $24,000. And the fourth level, the second level is loaning facility for farmers. Then the third level is microfinancing for members other than the farmers. So they could go into stores and all that, video game, a freezer, ice candy, and everything. The fourth one was the excess, which is also a greater part. The excess energy from the hydro was being paid in agreement by the utility. You could not have done that without the utility, because under the net metering rules, the utility is not mandated to pay the excess. It is only mandated to credit the excess here in the Philippines. But in this case, because they are part owner or in agreement, they want the microhydro to be sustainable. That's what they did. Okay? So if it remained isolated, you could see it's 12 to 18 years that you would be able to recover, 8 to 12 years with enterprising. If it connected, because it's now connected, it's 8 to 9 years with the microhydro alone. With enterprising, it's 5 to 6 years. Okay? So, in ending, I'd just like to say a few things. Other than the usual technical, financial, and environmental studies for viability, we always note that it should be socially and culturally accepted by the community. Otherwise, you'll have so much problem there. And it's institutionally sustainable, meaning finding the right people to manage. Usually, it is the local community, or in a bigger sense, it is the local utility, if you don't have trust in the local community. So, because the sense of ownership is very important. That's what makes it sustainable. People getting involved with the same advocacy, with the same commitment. And then flexibility in the business framework, meaning with the utility in it, your business framework was flexible from an isolated NPP, then you shifted to net metering. So everything it became more and more sustainable, being connected. So you could go isolated, and then you could also go grid connected. So I think I'll just say more later on after the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ernesto, Silvano. I think several things are coming out, also continuing from the last session, the importance of grid connectivity, importance of revolving funds, having local organizations supporting enterprises. These are all important. Next, I will ask Tri Mumpuni of IBEKA. And I have a few questions. IBEKA is very well known in this space. I think you're one of the pioneers in terms of the linking together enterprise and grid connectivity with the sustainability while maintaining community ownership of many of these systems. If you could give a quick background, Puni, of what is the IBEKA model and what has made the scale-up possible of that model?
Thank you, Bikash. He's my best friend since early 90s. I cannot imagine we still sit in the same place. In the first place, that what we are building was isolated, mainly isolated. Why? Because we running a program for rural electrification from renewable energy. Then the thing is, it's like an accident when we have very nice model where the farmers own only 13 kilowatts in West Java. The money coming from the bank is a loan. 7 years paid back will be perfect. Unfortunately, due to the political turbulence, not up to 7 years before the farmers can pay back the bank, only 4 years running, the utility came in. And of course, they are competing and no one can beat with the very high subsidy of national utility. Well, finally, the farmers, sorry to say that, died immediately, knowing that he cannot compete. Because of that, then IBEKA came in, and that was the fight when we go to the utilities and asking, you have to buy this energy because connect to grid is possible. Well, but more than 2 years, finally the government agreed to buy that with a very low marginal price, but we said we don't care as long as connect to grid, because once you connect to grid, then you can fight on other issue, which is how to increase the tariff. Finally, after all those turbulence, then in 2000, from 1992, can you imagine, in 2001, finally the first, what they called ministerial decree on connect to grid for the small hydro that owns by community, also private, also cooperative, then we have a very good tariff. And because of that, we developed not only for isolated, but we starting to have a connect to grid. And the famous one of a connect to grid is actually Cinta Mekar, 50% owned by the local farmers and 50% owned by local private. And the fund from the local farmer is actually coming from the United Nations in Bangkok, UNESCAP. Well, it's a very good example because everybody can see that how this can be really benefiting the local community, because not only this is connect to grid, but also the fund the fund that are collecting from the electricity sales goes for village development. This is why we still have the regime that social enterprises, also community enterprises, is also the same thing. In the first story was local farmers as a social enterprise that we support, and the second model is where the 50% owns by the community. What happened is that then many people are trying to look at and then start trying to copy, and I can imagine we have huge number. I cannot recall how many of them are really looking and trying to replicate that model, because the model was really good for utilities and also good for the enterprises. As long as the utility gave a good price, the price was actually decided by the government through the ministerial decree. But then recently I think it was like somehow I call it's not really in a good favor, because the price is based on negotiation. So we sort of look backward after we have a very good feed-in tariff. Then the utility decided, well, we should have a discussion. Then now we start again with the negotiation. But what I would like to explain here, what very important is why this can be replicated. The very important model can be replicated if what I always mention, the enabling condition environment is there, such as the very proper regulatory framework that the government has to be committed. So once you make and set up the price, then actually the price has to be the price that everybody happy. Meaning that whoever is the social enterprise jump to that activities, they will get, of course, margin from the activities. And also the utility also really get benefit, because you can imagine all the hydro that connect to grid mostly in a very remote area where the voltage is very bad, and once you have a hydro on that particular place, it's really make the technically really support the utility to have this improving the quality of the grid voltage. This is the first thing. And the second issue, if in that village there is a flow of money, I call it flow of income, as a streaming income revenue from the electricity sales, the community can start to have any other activities related to the economic development. I can imagine suddenly they can have partially oil, businesses run by the women. They can have lemongrass oil businesses. They can start everything due to the fresh money that came in, and the money from the electricity sales is also become the money that the cooperative can start to have a loan. So the community can start the businesses by lending the money from the cooperative. So first, after the regulatory. And then the second issue is also, of course, you have to create what we call it a proper arrangement of financing scheme. What kind of financial scheme that can support both businesses? Actually, it's not really profitable, but it's profitable. It's hard to say. Social businesses is that the business that running beyond profit and money. The businesses that really give a benefit to the local community. So we always talk to the local private investment. This is the money that not only looking for the profit as such, but your money is, you get the profit, but it's minimum profit, but at the same time you are helping to create the best planet on earth, because you are doing something that helping the community to get the benefit from their project. Well, that's about all I think that I can share. Anything else you want to share, then we can.
Thank you very much. Next I ask Sherzad. So Sherzad, the AKRSP model and AKDN, replication in many places, has in the past always been based on the concept of social capital, building social capital within communities, and microhydro has fit very well within that. Now, as we are talking about enterprise, how does the financial viability of that enterprise fit with the social enterprise model that AKRSP has been promoting? And is there a change in the model that you have had to take up, or is it a continuation of the earlier social capital model?
Thank you, Bikash. This is a critical question we are dealing with for the last 1 decade. Initially, when we started the microhydro program, and you are well aware that you were one of the supporters for microhydro program of AKRSP. The idea was to treat microhydro as other interventions we were doing. For example, if we go to the community, so we try to create the social capital. So we support the institution to do something for the people to reduce poverty. So we work in a mountain region with high poverty in high altitude villages. So luckily, the program was successful. The community showed the capacity and ability to construct and run the hydro. The quality was at question, right? Because we were developing the new technology, there was no local manufacturer, so they were also trying to cope. For example, initially the efficiency of our turbine was 40%, right? So now it is close to 100%. So in that time, the focus was on the social capital, and the efficiency, the sustainability of the unit was not in consideration. Once an evaluation was done by the donor, and we showed the economic, cost-benefit analysis showed that the cost-benefit ratio of the hydro on average was more than 12. You are spending 1 rupee, you are getting 12 rupees, right, economically. And the internal rate of return was so high. For some of the project I was involved in the analysis, it was 30%, right? So the first question came from the donor. It is so useful and so financially or economically so gainful. Why not private sector is there? Why you are asking for donor funds? So that was the question then that keep coming again and again, and we were forced to think about the sustainability of this project. One thing we tend to ignore as a development professional is, the micro hydro projects have limited project age, right? Project life. So you cannot construct a micro hydro for life. So it would be 10 years, it would be 15 years. So once the projects complete its project life, but the question was, these are not sustainable. They paid off. They completed their life cycle. So you need to reconstruct or fully replaced, right? So for example, we constructed more than 250 hydro. Now there are 182 are functionals. The other were abundant because there was a grid extension and they completed their life. We are following 2 models because I will not explain Aung development network is a big one so far. Responding to your initial question, how we can transform these micro hydro, which are community based, constructed with full donor grants, right? And now the sustainability is at question. So the one model we followed is Aung development network has 2 components. One is the economic side, the other is social. The economic side is, a business model. For example, if you, I don't know, you heard about the TPS, Tourism Promotion Services, the aviation service of Aung Development Network, banks and other hotels, right? So they are cross-subsidizing the social component. So one of the major institution in under economic component is Aung Fund for Economic Development. So they initiated institution, independent institution, which is called Pamir Energy, when there was a huge gap after Soviet Union went back from Tajikistan. So there was a huge gap of this electricity. So they renovated the government units, and they also built new units and produced around 45 megawatt. And they filled around 97% of the total gap there, right? And then they produced surplus. And they are providing this electricity to northern Afghanistan, around 35,000, and they are covering more than 200,000 households in Tajikistan. This is purely enterprise. So because ECFET is not dealing with the social development, they are not concerned with the subsidies, not concerned with any concession. So they said, we will develop this, so we will invest, and we need to recover our money. The issue was part of a Khan Development Network. The other institution, the social institution, for example, MSDSP, which is like AKRSP in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So they said, no, look, they are poor. 20% of the households are poor. How can we, expect to pay the 100% bill? So no, we are not concerned. So we are enterprise, we are sustainable, right? So we have to provide the subsidy from the social side by identifying the households and covering their expenses. So this is one model, because the primary energy, the ECFET is not concerned with the poverty. This is again the concern for the social development side, and MESDP and Khan Foundation there. This one model, this is very successful, right? If you provide subsidies, they will cut the line, the meters, disconnect them, right? And provide the additional electricity to Afghanistan and somewhere else where there is a demand. The other component, which is very relevant to your question, the community-based micro hydro in mostly in Pakistan and northern part of Afghanistan, we were struggling with. For small units, it's okay. If it's 30 kilowatt, if it is 40 kilowatts, so it is okay. The community manages it through a committee, and they charge flat rate. And the only concern is the running cost, right? If there is a issue in maintenance, so they can buy, they can repair the power channel or pen stock or replace the generator, right? And they can recover the cost of the operator and other cost of the operations. When it goes up to 500 kilowatt, let's say 500 kilowatt is very expensive one. For 500 kilowatt, you need because you cannot produce, we don't have the capacity for manufacturing turbine and generator, so we import from foreign countries, for example, Chinese technology. So one, this is expensive, importing the E&M. The other thing is managing 500 kilowatt. It is a sophisticated technology, so you cannot ask the community to run 500 half megawatt electricity with iron poles, HD line, sophisticated system. So we thought that we need to transform this management committee into a professional setup. So this is why Meherban was telling you about this community, local community-based utility company. So the model is all the beneficiary household in the vicinity of the hydro, in the watershed or in the valley, are shareholders, right? For example, we have one unit of 500 kilowatt, and they are providing electricity to 1,100 households. All the 1,100 households are shareholders. They provide equity, and there is a grant from AKRSP or Khan Foundation, and there is a loan component. Initially from, if you remember, in the CDM, so we got loan from Equipment Fund. Now, Khan Development Networks Bank, which is called Habib Bank Limited. So they are providing this loan, right? So it is a hybrid model. So the objective is to first recover the loan, and then AKRSP can shift the shares to this community utility model. So we are now trying to make these utility companies sustainable. So far, the experience that there is a high ownership from the community, and there is interest from the community in terms of these shares, because they are profit companies.
Thank you. I'll ask more questions later about how to take some of the existing community systems and turn them into more enterprise focus. But for now, it's useful to know that there is a transition happening, and there is the community model still, but there are also some enterprise models right from the beginning, especially for some of the larger systems. Next, maybe I ask Myint from REAM. So one interesting thing that Dipti pointed out earlier was that we noticed when we were looking at some of the Myanmar models that they were following kind of a modified cooperative model. So apparently the cooperatives in Myanmar had a particular problem with low incentive to create profits because everybody owned it. And, so as a result, the government changed the rules, I think somewhere in the 1990s, where they would allow some members of the community to own more of the shares. So in a cooperative, typically it's one member, one share, and you cannot sell outside the cooperative. The problem with that model is that it's everybody's, it's nobody's. And so there was that incentive disappeared. And so they still called it cooperative, but allowed some people to own more. And this is similar to the model, the SPV that Satishji was talking about earlier, where you actually have some people there who are investing more than the others. So one of the questions for us is that model seems to have worked, and there are several projects in Myanmar, one of which Dipti and I saw, where you basically have the equipment manufacturer is also has some shares in the project. He had brought together 24 other owners, and they own the majority of the shares, and they sell to the larger community 500. So even though 24 people own the enterprise and sell to 500 people, it still is falling under the cooperative law, right? So it allowed them to still call it a cooperative, but build in that incentive there so that these 24 people had an interest in making sure that the tariff was maintained and it was running well. So just one question in terms of the government support, the DRD program, whether this model has possibility of expansion under the current program, and what should government do to expand this model?
Yes, if we really focus only upon the cooperative model, it's a little difficult for me to express my my point to mention about the Myanmar the microhydro entrepreneur, because the enterprise who are working in the microhydro business in Myanmar is privately happened. I think 20 kilowatt to 5 megawatt range. A lot of the range the privates are happening, but mostly of them are running privately and without any support of grant or the finance support or the policy support or the development the agency support. This is the one unique situation. But among that, so many the enterprises running by using the microhydro for the electrification. This is their own struggle of the people to get electricity for their development, for their enterprise, or for their the end user.
So what role is government playing in scaling the
that's
private?
the point I will try to reach.
Yeah.
Among those activities, some try to survive because to do business in there's such kinds of the enterprise, small business with hydro in Myanmar. They have to survive too. They have to be certain measure of recognition, maybe license or the certificate or the permit or those many things. So, and it's necessary. And many other things are very complicated. But for the matter of the existence of the one enterprise, cooperative is the only one in Myanmar. The semi-government, the entity, recognized by the government, and that is the one they try to get that brand, to run the business. But they never expect to get any support or any regulatory support or financial support from that line of cooperative. This is very clear. But they get, because of that small registration, under the name of their business, they can operate starting measure of recognition by the government atmosphere. That is a reality. And you are talking about the cooperative law change, in 19 around, because last time cooperative is all the consumer are the one vote each, to get the equity share, But at that time, because of the situation of the country, the policy is changed, the cooperative policy is changed. Only 5 members, can form a cooperative, even though he is running with so many consumer. And that is one of the advantage for the business sector. That advantage is used by so many other businesses, but not only by that cooperative hydro is very rare. But some of our entrepreneurs, they try to use that one, and it can survive because of that token, and among the government atmosphere. But one thing it is very sure is he used some of the amount of, he electrified, I think, 13 villages, 13 villages. But these 13 villages, most of the households are electrified, but all the members are the household who use electricity are not a cooperative member. But some of the members, some of the key people among the villages, he become his member, share some money. But the money sharing mostly, he cannot rely upon that money, the share by those people. But to become his business, he has to create another source of fund himself. But that's a unique situation. We cannot consider within the cooperative principle to do it. But that one, if your question, that at the moment Myanmar government have a DRD is implementing the World Bank, the mini grid scheme. At that one, that kinds of situation, that cooperative, that kinds of scheme have one very important. The situation is the grant provide to the consumer who are developer and together with the consumer, they have to be owned the business to electrification business, using the fund of the government or whatever, the share 40, 20, 20 share. But this is the point very important, This is the point, who own that, the business, the electrification business. But at the moment, since the movement of government fund is launching, the owner is the government, and also together with the village community and the developer. And at the times of their payment, a starting measure of 8 years, 10 years, they will own. But it's not sure, because the village sites, they are the real beneficiary. Right. They have no ownership sense at the moment of that trend. If the cooperative is a government, Myanmar government existing, the regulation can use as a one of the what we call the cooperative, from the cooperative, those all the government trend of the DRD, the mini grid assistance, it's very good, but it is very difficult to make it practice because the advantage is regulation is there. Already. Right. And that's why it can use, but the private sector already use, a certain measure of his, the management. But government sector may have a better management. And because they have a much more authority to influence the people, to obey their, the certain measure of regulation. That's why I think it is the answer for me. Cooperative is cooperative, But this is, according to certain recent image in Myanmar, cooperative cannot be applied, strategically because of that previous bad image. But at the moment of situation, this is the real existing regulation in Myanmar. It can form up to the level of the village to the higher level. This is the one. This is the one already used by the private sector in Myanmar at the moment. We have a ground situation, and this is the sector that already exists in Myanmar, to be applied if government want to use as a cooperative, as a body, right, to combine with the government DRD program, something like that.
Thank you. I mean, this is one problem, not just in Myanmar, but in a lot of places where sort of the enterprise model, an individual entrepreneur like Bir Bahadur owning his microhydro, often works well. Myanmar has example of hundreds of these. The challenge comes in when government tries to scale it up. Oftentimes the government comes in with subsidy resources. But one of the conditions of the subsidy is that government cannot transfer money to individual entrepreneurs. They have to transfer it to communities. And when they transfer it to communities, the individual owner then is never secure that they can be running this for the long term. So in Nepal, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we went through this entire cycle where initially entrepreneurs were eligible for government subsidy. Then that got taken out because when there is a large government program, people say, no, why should we give money to entrepreneurs? That should go to the people. Then the cycle comes around where if it is completely owned by the communities, the incentive to operate this as an enterprise, to operate it so that it maximizes productive uses, all of that declines. I mean, I have seen both in northern Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, everywhere, you will see that all day the power plant is left not running because the community really just wants electricity at night. And the government's already given a subsidy, so they feel like, why work the machine so hard? You know, we got this grant after a lot of struggle, it might break. So let it just rest all day so that it can be again producing electricity in the evening for lighting. So that's very much a mentality that comes in. In Chitral, I have seen a site where, you know, there was a diesel mill which was still running right next to the power plant. So I said, you know, why is that diesel mill not being run by the electricity? And they said, well, because he's doing his business, we are paying for it. It's not that the community did not feel some sense of ownership. There was a committee going house to house and checking people's bulbs, making sure that there was no abuse. It wasn't a lack of ownership. But when you went to the powerhouse and looked at how much was being consumed, 20 kilowatt power plant was being used for 5 kilowatts. So, you know, they feel like, I've got this plant, as Sherzad, you mentioned. This is a grant that came once. If it breaks, there is no money to, you know, we have to go back again to get a whole grant. So let's preserve this to the extent we can. So I think it's an antithesis of like the enterprise model where this power plant can be like a, you know, powering economic enterprises in that area. It's seen very much, not much, this is why I was asking you the question, are people treating this any differently than an irrigation canal or a water system or a road? Because it's energy and it has the opportunity to power economic growth in a particular way, and the more economic growth, the more demand there is, and then there is the need for expansion of that. That whole cycle was not completed because people felt like this is a one-time grant we have received and let's protect it and let's not overuse it. And the element of, you know, incentive either through private ownership or some form of cooperative or a special project vehicle where there is some benefit that can go back to the community, unless that is built in, it seems like that ownership management model stands directly in the way of like a expansion. So let me move to Senator Lasimbang. And so you're a senator, you are now in government, you are initially a microhydro advocate like all of us. What in government can you do, or what should government be doing in order to encourage that these systems, both that microhydro is developed, but that it is also run as an enterprise to be sustainable long term?
Okay, thank you very much. Having been the advocate for microhydro for the last 20 years, actually it's a good opportunity for me actually now being part of the new government in Malaysia. But before we can even recommend or advocate for something for our new government, we have to look at what have the previous government have been doing. And if you look at Malaysia, microhydro has been really suppressed. In fact, none of the development of microhydro was supported by the government because of one or two bad experiences where million ringgit projects were failed because of incompetent people doing it. But then the whole renewable energy, or mainly used for off-grid systems, is saturated with all these solar home systems. Our government really spent a lot of money in terms of solar home system, only to realize that this system cannot sustain for a long time. And the moment the new government came in, our minister, Myint, was looking at what was the government doing all this while. And they were looking at all this solar home system, and the first task that were given to us is look at why this system fails in the first place. Again, because these are government handouts, it's like really handout in a sense that there's no sustainability model, there's no empowerment in terms of how the community can take part and operate and make sure this system is sustained. So it gives us a good opportunity, because throughout the 15 years that I've been doing this microhydro, there was no support from the government. It was really a grant based. Later on, because Malaysia becomes like a middle income country and we don't we're not can get this grant assistance anymore, so we had to innovate ourselves to become more and more social based enterprise, social enterprise based models. So that's how we managed to execute and also deploy a lot of this community-based microhydro in Malaysia, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak, in the Borneo side of Malaysia. So when we had this program, the first thing our minister was to visit few of these successful projects. And one of the most important key points is, I think some of our colleagues have already pointed out, is incentive for the community to run the system, because they need to recover some of the costs. Because a lot of the projects was funded through a revolving fund. So they really need to have an enterprise to ensure that the price that each household pay is smaller, not too high. So there must be an anchor tenant or anchor enterprise that buy bulk of the energy coming from the microhydro. So that's why we really need to make sure that the social enterprise can be there. So for me, being in the new government, we have a task force now. We are trying to see how this community-based model can be replicated or implemented under the government system. Because most of the time, the government framework is like this. They have procurement, and then they will hire a contractor, they build it, and then send it to hand it over to the local government, which most of the time the local government have no resources to maintain these systems. So when we engage with the government, especially the Ministry of Environment and also the Energy, we try to put a social enterprise or enterprise-based incorporated in the project, so that they can be funded together with the construction of the microhydro. I think we have to design the system. Has to be well thought of rather than afterthought in the system. I think that's how it is.
Thank you very much. Let me open it up to the floor. Specific questions, please indicate who it's for. We were very clear?
Clear.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Silvano, as part of the NEA, with this model successful, do you think the Philippines government or programs or policy could scale this in some way? Like what kind of mechanisms could be used? We actually we have members in the Philippines doing community-based microhydro, and they are now, from these examples, thinking about more of the enterprise-based models. And this is the example that you showed is certainly a guiding light. But what do you think are the steps to the transition, and what is the role of government in that?
Kind of hard question, because there are already existing more than 150 microhydros that are not within the standards. So that is a problem. What we're doing, what we have for the new ones, they are grid ready and following the standards of the distribution grid. So that model, that one I presented is the model that we are replicating. But for I think particularly for there are already 150 with the company you're helping. So their models are not standards. So we have a problem there to interconnect. Should have been more sustainable if we could help there interconnect it. Because before, I have the same apprehension. I was not about to believe that interconnecting it to the grid would make it more sustainable. Not until I saw it myself. Not until we did it ourselves. So that's something really. And we have done two, and we have more coming for the new ones. But for the old, I think we have to find ways as part of the government is concerned. That's more on the distribution lines.
So grid connectivity after the fact is difficult because technically these things are not suitable.
Yeah, for the
so you have to design that beforehand, you're saying?
That's right. We have already, that is a problem.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, panel. It was very, very intriguing. My name is Maury Hausman. I'm with a company in U.S. called Helios. We are a developer and provider of a proprietary microhydro system. Actually, I should call it Pico hydro system. I wanted to share with you an experience we had in Philippines, which is very important in the context of the discussion. Like other technology developers, we believe we have a great technology, but how do you actually implement it? How do you get the community and users to adopt it? So we not only had to have a new technology, but we had to really create a system around this technology to be used. Our system can be used for grid connect application as well as off-grid. So we were very interested in Philippines market, and for the last 2-3 years we've been working with the government, communities, NGOs, and we about a year ago started working with National Irrigation Administration here, controls all of the canals and waterways and irrigation system. So the model that we had proposed to them was utilizing a microhydro that would in no way impact the intended use of the canals. They loved the idea. They said, all right, here are a few canals. You can go ahead and show us what you have. The next challenge for us was to actually get a community that totally invest their resources. Obviously, these communities, rural communities, don't have a lot of money, but they're very proud. They are very entrepreneurial. So we got together with a community in northern Mindanao, a village called Kibanban near Balangasak. So we got the barangay chief to first of all understand what the technology is. We had them to pick the locations that we wanted to put our microsystem, because we actually can go along a creek and add our systems in series. And we also had a couple of people in the community trained how to install and maintain and so forth. The other important thing was to actually make the system reliable. they had to see that this is actually serving a value, not for us to demonstrate to NIA that this was a reliable technology, but we want them to be dependent on it in a good way. The project went in about, I guess about 6 months ago. It has been a success. And we are replicating that in Philippines and other places. And my conclusion is this. There are three things that really made this project differentiate. First of all was community involvement. Second thing was the reliability of the system. And the third thing was the cost. Because the cost was actually, they saw it was very, very low and sustainable. So I believe this is something that can be replicated and successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike? Yeah, one last one.
Thank you. Perhaps this is for Tree or the panel in general. From what I heard was, Bikash, you also pointed that out, that in a sense the subsidies created a disincentive for that enterprise model to continue. And you cited the example of specifically a grant for the fixed asset, for the generating asset. Is there a way to have subsidies work in a different way that would engender the enterprise model to continue? And is it dependent upon that different kind of ownership? Because I've heard that also, that if the ownership within the community model was concentrated, it essentially created an incentive for a utility to sell to its customers. So you're kind of getting around the community ownership model. But I guess really it's the interaction of those two things is a way of getting past assets that just end up being abandoned or neglected or not incentivized to operate. Could you get, is it an ownership question or the way the grant is used, or a combination of both? And maybe others want to comment on that too.
Well, in our case, I think it's completely about the grant mechanism. Why I say that? Once we're successful with the subsidy that go directly to the part of the ownership of the local community, then we would like to enlarge this and replicate to other places. Then when we came to the government, because the government put so much subsidy, 100% grant for the community owned, and I said, why don't you, why don't you create a program that the community owns and then building not off-grid but on-grid? They said, no. The government fund is only can go for those who are unelectrified and for the off-grid. So there is no way channel that we trying to create through the government fund that can be going directly to the local community to create the, I call it community enterprises, But then it's a very interesting issue when the utility starting to have what we call it, I cannot find the right term, but the term is that, well, you build that using our money, but you pay us with the energy. It means that the utility providing the local community grant, but it is calculated in the energy that will be sold to the grid. Unfortunately, the program is not really in place yet. Then the minister is changing, and Indonesia is a very beautiful country. Changing the minister, changing the regulatory. Thank you.
I would just like to add a few comments on that. Apart from what Ibu Tri have already mentioned, I think it's also related to the capacity of the communities. Sometimes we do have grants. For example, in Malaysia, we have this Malaysian Electricity Supply Trust account, which basically subsidize a lot of these off-grid systems. Unfortunately, it cannot just be deployed like that. There has to be a condition is like they have to make sure that the community have certain capability to manage this. And secondly, it end up like the system will be owned by the utility company, because Malaysia have a full total monopoly of sales of power in Malaysia. Anything that is sell has to be somewhat sold by the national utility. So even though it's an off-grid, mini-grid, it's still owned by eventually. that is the problem.
Well, just a second. We're lucky that off-grid is community owned. It's okay, not on-grid.
Responding to your question, yes, we need to customize the arrangement. the system to use the subsidy in a different way that can contribute to the sustainability of the unit. But we need to keep in mind that as a development professional, the micro hydro is not a standalone project. It is part of the community development. So in the mountain area where we work, this is an agrarian society. So the entrepreneurship is a new concept, right? So you need to work to change the mindset that in both supply and demand side, the people understand the importance of the entrepreneurship and the enterprise model that can contribute to the sustainability of this unit.
For Myanmar situation, if we focus only on the enterprise, hydro enterprise development, not the community, the small community, a lot of other social value difference. But for the enterprise, mostly we have a lot of discussion and workshop, with them. What is their difficulty? They always say they are the business people, but they always say they don't want any grant, they don't want any subsidy. They want the soft loan, to make to assess their business thoroughly, and then how is their the payment ability, what is their feasibility situation. But they confidence upon their business, but they want bank soft loan. This is the one their requirement. Another one is there's a lot of gap. In first session, the one lady is discussing about it. The gap is the bankability. There's a lot of principles. The Myanmar people are not much familiar with the bank, how they can apply and what is their quality. They have to be mentioned by themselves. This is even though they have a lot of capacity and a lot of the performance they have done, they cannot express thoroughly. This is a gap. This is a gap from the bank side also. Bank don't know how they will assess for the hydro matter. And even at the same time, the government side, government have to regulate, have to be take care, is it to make it thorough. Government side also, they need capacity to make it bankable. By the private sector side and also the bank, the bank side and also the government sides.
Thank you. I think I'm supposed to wrap up. I would just conclude with that last question there. I think the recommendation that has been coming through both the sessions is oftentimes credit is more important than subsidy. Yes. Subsidy, is sometimes just historically has been given in some of these countries. It's hard to take away, but I think and for a lot of donors and governments, it seems easier to give than setting up a loan program. So increasingly in places like Myanmar, where government wasn't so strong and rural people are actually used to paying pretty high tariff, we saw tariffs 30 cents, 25 cents per kilowatt hour. I think there, really, if you can continue charging those tariffs for hydro, you don't need a grant. But the problem is banks are not giving loans for more than a year. They can't take deposits for more than a year, therefore they cannot make loans for more than a year. So, it's just that the banking sector is new, and so when you don't have that, it's really important to set up a revolving fund. That should really precede any discussion of a grant. I mean, in Nepal, the subsidy is kind of justified in the sense that there's a vibrant IPP sector. And the IPP sector is producing, as Satish ji said earlier, at around 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour average. And off-grid hydro, even one as well run as Bir Bahadur's, is barely selling 50% of the energy it could produce, just because of the nature of microhydro. Even with him having different tariff at different times of day, etc., you cannot sell all the energy that you produce from a microhydro. It's just that everybody goes to sleep at night and everybody's out in the fields all day. So you cannot do away with that reality. It's not like the grid where you have industries in the daytime and other types of things. So even a microhydro that works as hard as his does, typically 50%. And so you would say, well, either you could do like a viability gap funding analysis or bid it out or something and say, let's see how little subsidy people need. Or in Nepal, what they've basically done is to say, let's provide about 50% subsidy. Because compared to the IPP guys, so if the same IPP were to decide, am I investing in a grid-connected IPP or an off-grid system, the 50% grant on the off-grid system would kind of even it out. So I think that's, a simple way to do it. You could also bid it out and say, what's the minimum subsidy you will accept? But either way, I mean, I think bringing in people, who will invest, maybe have a loan in there, I think somebody already pointed out, communities, user groups oftentimes cannot take loans. So there is a need for them to become official in some way, either as a cooperative or like a public limited company or an entrepreneur or somebody. Otherwise, they cannot go to the bank and take a loan. The moment they're taking a loan, the moment the subsidy is reduced, I think there's a lot of pressures to make this thing perform well. If it's close to 100% grant, it really becomes an entitlement program, and people don't really think about getting the most out of it. They think about preserving it and not having to kind of go back and try and get another one like this one. So thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Please give a round of applause.